Ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and it would seem that the great framerate debate rages on yet again in 2024 with a recent statement from Ninja Theory's visual effects director regarding Hellblade 2, where in a recent interview with the website GamePro, they stated that Hellblade 2 running at 30 FPS on both the Xbox Series S and Series X should feel more cinematic, similar to movies that run at 24 frames per second. Now, I've discussed this topic multiple times in the past. The first time we saw this argument crop up in terms of video games was all the way back in 2014, with Ubisoft developers claiming that Assassin's Creed Unity only running at 30 frames per second was a good thing as it was more cinematic, claiming that 60 frames per second doesn't look like the real thing. And even though this entire concept has been debunked and brought back up numerous times over the past decade, we will invariably see people regurgitating this intellectually dishonest claim, to the point where you even have some gamers, such as this one here from April of last year, claiming that manually locking their frames per second to 25 made the game more immersive. So, in order to discuss this properly, we need a little bit of context. First, just to cover definitions, there are two different terms that have become somewhat interchangeable, even though mechanically they are somewhat different. The first is frame rate, the second is hertz. Frame rate is the number of times a new frame is delivered within a time span of 1 second, hence FPS, or frames per second. A frame rate of 30 is 30 FPS, 30 frames per second, and that term came from film, the movie industry, where the video and audio were shown in theaters on massive rolls of film, many of them several miles in length. You see, film is a bit like a flip book, where you have progressive images, and as you flip the pages of the book, it creates the illusion of motion. The film is the exact same concept, and the film industry decided on 24 frames of film per second as being the bare minimum needed for the human eye and the human brain to work together to fill in the gaps just enough that the illusion of motion could be believed. It was ultimately a decision made to make certain only the least amount of film was used to create movie reels, as those were extremely expensive to produce. Even if you decided to take a film reel from 24 frames per second up to 25 frames per second, the cost for producing the reels goes up significantly. But thanks to scenesavers.com, we can garner a bit more perspective regarding that. For a 2-hour-long film shot on 35mm film at 24 frames per second, it would take 10,800 feet of film, or roughly 2.04 miles of film rounded down. To increase that by a single frame per second, that is taking it up to 25 frames per second, that increases the amount of film to 11,250 feet, or 2.13 miles rounded down. That is 450 feet of film required for each single frame per second used within a 2-hour-long movie. So you can begin to see why the film industry was so keen on only using as much film as was necessary, and that is also why 24 frames per second became the standard within the film industry. But what about video games? Why are they different? Graphics cards still create the illusion of motion by generating a certain number of images per second, just like film. So what's the difference? Well, there are a couple. But first, I want to show you a couple of examples, and then we'll discuss the reason as to why it matters. So the Ninja Theory developer claims that Hellblade 2 at 30 FPS on the Xbox is more cinematic, where the true cinematic is 24 frames per second. Well, the YouTuber Wolfgang put out a very good comparison video some 6 years back, and I'll link to that video in the description if you want to see the full comparison. The first comparison is from Fallout 4. And this next comparison is from Need for Speed Payback. And then this last comparison is from PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Now, some people with a bit of a discerning eye would have noticed that, particularly with the Need for Speed Payback scenario that we just saw, that when the player does not change their perspective, the 24 frames per second gameplay seemed to smooth out a bit, and the artifacting and tearing became less noticeable. And it is precisely because of perspective, or view perspective, is why, or at least one of the reasons why lower frame rates in any game is not only not more cinematic, but it is objectively inferior. It is also because how the images are delivered to the human eye are fundamentally different. In film, a light is shown through the slide, which goes through a lens and displays that image directly onto a bit of white canvas. That image is then immediately visible to the human eye. But with video games, you have your graphics card sending out images at 30 Hz or 30 frames per second, but those don't go immediately to the human eye to be perceived. Those images are then sent to your monitor or television, which has its own refresh rate measured in Hertz. And unless you have a gaming monitor capable of a higher refresh rate, that monitor or television will have either a 59.97 Hz or a 60 Hz refresh rate. Which means that for a game running at 30 frames per second, the monitor or television is refreshing twice for each new image it receives. Now, VSync helps a great deal and has come leaps and bounds in the past decade, but for the cleanest gameplay, you will want the number of images being delivered from your video card and the refresh rate of your monitor or TV to be as close as possible to prevent that artifacting and stuttering that we see in those examples. And the reason for that is changes in perspective due to player input. Now, changes in perspective, like you see within video games where player input directly shifts what is being displayed, do not happen in film. In film, it is entirely static. Each image is pre-planned exactly and will not be altered. Not true in video games. Even a minor shift with your mouse or the directional pad of your controller changes the view perspective. And for that transition of movement to be smooth, the new images being delivered must be done as close to the refresh rate of the monitor as possible. Again, VSync helps a great deal with that, but the closer you get, the better, the easier it is for the systems to be able to adapt to each other. And if you find value in content like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and share your own thoughts on the great frame rate debate in the comments down below. Now, another example we have of 30 frames per second versus 60 and even 120 is from the channel Yesterday's Tech about 1 year ago. And as you can see, there is stuttering and blurring that occurs, which becomes far less noticeable the higher the frame rate goes. Now, naturally, this will become more apparent in games with a higher focus on perspective shifts, first-person shooters, driving games, and the like. But a higher frame rate for a video game is never going to degrade its quality and only serves to help improve it. So no, ultimately there is no such thing as more cinematic when it comes to video games and their frame rates. And I feel genuine pity for those that think they do, as they're completely incorrect. But there are people out there that prefer a higher graphical fidelity at the expense of better gameplay, but that also ultimately boils down to hardware limitations. And while I can respect those people who want their games to look as pretty as possible, even if they only run at 30 or sub 30 frames per second, a more pro-consumer decision game developers can make would be to leave that decision up to the player as opposed to making the unilateral decision for them, or to lock the frame rate in order for multi-console parity, such with the Xbox Series S and the Series X. But, you know, what do I know? At the end of the day, I'm just a mook with a mic. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I'll see you next time.